Cut the head off one and two will rise. Or, they'll just stop showing up because you couldn't think of anything interesting to do with them. Hey, folks. This you might assume is largely springboarding off of the latest entry in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the MCU, that being Captain America: New World Order. And you would only be partially correct. At time of recording, I still haven't seen it yet. I intend to, but it's not going to be for a little while yet. My girlfriend actually wants to see it with me, so I'll be a little bit behind on that, but I am hoping to get to it if we can get out together to see it. But I have noted in some of the reviews that I've seen that the issue, or one of the issues with the film, is that its politics seem either muddled or absent, which is kind of an ongoing problem with the MCU for a while now. And I am sure that there are some critics out there who have very pointed opinions on the political leanings of the MCU. The simple truth is that the Marvel movies want the broadest possible audience, yet they also can't seem to resist dipping, at least superficially, into some very political ideas and then not having the guts to do much with them, or they're sort of dancing on eggshells around the issue. Way of approaching things results in actually undermining the political aspects that they end up bringing into it. Falcon and the Winter Soldier series and the villains of the Flag Smashers leap immediately to mind, quite prominently as far as that goes, but also if you suffered through Secret Invasion, it's a big problem with that as well. As I said, this isn't really about Captain America: New World Order, but I did hear that criticism and find myself thinking, why don't we just bring back Hydra? Now, I'm going to be going over a few things with this. The first, I am going to touch a little bit on how the MCU has handled Hydra up to this point, because it has not always been well. So this is not just me saying, they were good villains, bring them back. No, actually, the MCU screwed them up at a few points. And while I will be touching on some of the comic origins, I am largely going to be leaving the comics out of it because, well, the history of Hydra in the comics is long and complicated, and this isn't that kind of channel to go through the full history of that. But I will be referencing it here and there. But limiting it to the MCU, Hydra has a connection in the MCU that it has always had in the original comics. Hydra has always had an entanglement with Hitler's Germany, with the Nazis. That is something that actually the very first Captain America film kind of botched, like right off the bat. I don't know where the general opinion is right now on that movie. I've actually never super cared for the original Captain America. I'm not saying there's nothing good in it. Some aspects are very good. The overall tone is incredibly fitting. Chris Evans is just perfect casting as Steve Rogers. He was immediately and right off the bat. There's a few other good performances in there. The makeup on the Red Skull is fantastic, but Hydra as an organization does not work really at all for a couple of reasons. There's the initial reason, which is that it never feels like they're winning.
You are failing!
It feels like they are being beaten back at every single point. Even the ways in which they try to make Hydra feel dangerous by like, oh no, Bucky died, quote unquote. Like, okay, yeah, the good guys lost somebody, but they also won. Like, we never see Hydra winning. And like the big scary Hydra technology is it's just higher end guns that you put in the hand of these losers are just as useless as if they were using guns with bullets. And guys with guns with bullets are taking them out just fine. So Hydra fails to be in any way threatening in that. That does kind of bleed over to the Red Skull. I don't want to knock the performance. However, I think Red Skull aside from looking great and being pretty well performed from a writing perspective, is never a proper threat. Not really. He just looks the part very well. And Hugo Weaving certainly does his best with it. I don't want this to be too much about the Red Skull, but he's very tied into Hydra, so it's going to come up. But one of the other things that they did right off the bat that I think was a massive mistake, and I kind of took issue with even at the time, was the fact that the MCU almost immediately distanced them from the Nazis. Hydra breaks away from the Nazis almost immediately. Following Steve's transformation and the chase that results in the immediate aftermath of that, the very next scene is Hydra breaking away from the Nazis. At that point, Hydra aren't really Nazis anymore. On all the maps with the battle plans, they have little H's to indicate Hydra bases, nothing to indicate the Nazis. So effectively, in this movie, Captain America never actually fights any Nazis, which has always bothered me. Which means that we go from a film that did have the guts to still have Captain America be created to take on Nazis and to recreate the imagery of Captain America punching Hitler. I'll give them credit for that, but then immediately move on to, okay, we're not dealing with Nazis anymore. Why not? Why not? Why are you taking Hydra and instead of having them in Nazi uniforms, slapping them in these face-concealing masks and helmets that just make them seem like stormtroopers, giving them a completely different salute, which doesn't look good anyways, but that distancing from the Nazis was the first big mistake I think that the MCU made. Because if you look at the comics, while Hydra's history predates the Nazis, I'll circle back to that, and has gotten complicated post-World War II because Hydra, somewhat fittingly to the name, has at times fractionalized, and there have been different branches of Hydra. But Hydra as an organization has never really shaken off the Nazi association in the comics. And it shouldn't. That should always be there. It is, or at least should, always be acceptable and agreed upon as being acceptable that Nazis are unequivocal bad guys. And if you make them, or anybody tied to them, the bad guys, you have a incredibly punchable, a hateable villain that everybody's on side with you, or at least they should be. And backing away from the Nazi connection with Hydra, again, feels motivated like, well, we don't want to get too political. Okay, but the political statement is Nazis suck and should die. Is that really a statement you want to back away from? Marvel? Disney? Really? That's a controversial idea to you? It's not really. I'm not accusing them of being secret sympathizers or anything like that. And no, we're not getting into any possible connections with Walt Disney's own history. I don't need to be dealing with any of that in my comments section. Leave it alone. But the just general nature of being afraid to make a point, you could feel it right off the bat. Now, not everything done with Hydra was bad. I would say Hydra was at its best in the sequel, Captain America, Winter Soldier. And also a little bit Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I did eventually leave Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., so if some other stuff was done with them after the point where I dropped off, I won't know that, but I'm going to cover that as well, at least up to a point. The way Hydra was handled within Winter Soldier is this notion of, well, yes, Hydra was gone, but not really. The lingering effects of people who held those ideas, held that ideology. Maybe they went underground, maybe they were no longer comfortable being visible, but they were always present. And they were still trying to mold the world into what they wanted. That was a really good use of Hydra. And I think would have been better if they'd maintained the Nazi connection a little bit more strongly. But they didn't. But at least the idea of that, of this harmful, hateful ideology, this might makes right, we must command the world because freedom is a bad idea, That being an insidious thing that has wormed its way into power and has done so by maintaining a plausible deniability that that's what it is. Yeah, it was relevant at the time they did it. Feels even more relevant now. But that was a very good use of Hydra. After that, not a lot, really. They kind of get just randomly dealt with at the start of the second Avengers movie. They're taking down a Hydra base because they needed an opening action scene, and for pretty much no other reason. Baron von Strucker is present and just immediately dealt with. Again, lacking the firm connection. We had it a little bit in Winter Soldier with the nature of what was going on with Zola. But again, while you could make a parallel between Zola and any of the Nazi-affiliated scientists who were brought over in Operation Paperclip back in the day, that still was weakened slightly by the distancing of Hydra from the Nazis, which again, the comics have been, for the most part, pretty good about avoiding doing. I mean, like, there's a reason this image was so controversial. It wasn't because, oh no, they made Captain America a villain. It was because they made Captain America, created by Jewish creators, a Nazi. People got that Hydra was a direct connection to Nazis. And that's something that I think in many ways kind of hampered that story, at least in terms of it being received and how the reception went down. There's other issues with that storyline anyways. I know there's rumors we might be getting Hydra Cap. I'm not sure I'd actually recommend doing that, but then again, the MCU does have a history of taking a actually not very good comic story and making something decent out of it. Civil War comes to mind. Granted, they scrapped most of the storyline and mainly just kept the title and who was on what side of the divide. But then again, that was a while back in the MCU in its current state. I'm not sure I would trust to improve on the Secret Empire storyline. But anyways, we've gone mildly off track. My point being, the idea that Hydra were Nazis is something that the comics have been pretty decent about keeping in mind. It was right down to the point that during one of the big DC Marvel Comics crossovers, initially the Joker and the Red Skull kind of linked up until the Joker found out he was a Nazi and got pissed, because apparently, at least at that point in time, for all the issues that the Joker had, for all the madness he was willing to do, he was not okay with siding with a Nazi. Even has this great line of like, I might be a psychopath, but I'm an American psychopath. Like, it's kind of ridiculous, but it's also kind of awesome. And again, keeping in mind what these people represent, what they are a stand-in for. Because at a certain point, you can lose the connection of what something was meant to symbolize if you don't reinforce that. I would actually argue in an odd way, Doctor Who has kind of lost the symbolism of the Daleks, which were also based on Nazis. When first introduced, it was not incredibly subtle, but for anyone who missed it by chance, by the time they got around to the genesis of the Daleks during the Fourth Doctor's era, sometime later, they made it super clear. Yeah, these are the Nazis. And unfortunately, the show hasn't done an exceptional job of re-upping that connection since then. It's still there, don't get me wrong. I'm not going to say they've undermined it, but they haven't reinforced it. They've let people forget a little bit, or at least have the ability to. And you shouldn't. The other thing that I mentioned with Hydra was Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Now, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., I bailed back end of season 3, and it had to do with the killing off of my favorite character in the show. Now, when I say favorite character, I don't mean good person, but I mean favorite character. Ward. Now, this is kind of going to be a spoiler for the first couple seasons, at least in regards to his character. But When Ward shows up initially at the start of the first season, he's boring as hell. He's wooden. He's just flat. He's big hero man. He's generic. It's like, what are we doing with this guy? Then towards the back end of the first season, at the same time that the storyline of Captain America and the Winter Soldier happened, we find out Ward is a Hydra agent, which does a couple of things. The first is it actually kind of excuses his wooden performance up to that point because he couldn't just relax and be himself. He was undercover. He was faking who he was. Yeah, it was a little stilted. It wasn't real. And by the time we get to the second season, that point really gets hammered home. And they did something that I'm actually really grateful for, because the end of that first season, it seems like he's hesitating. It seems like he's going to break rank. It seems like they're going to do a redemption for him. Then we get into the second season and into the third season, and they don't. What they actually do is reinforce over and over again that Ward is horrible. He is a horrible person, whether he is tied into Hydra or not. He is a bad guy. He's really good at it, too. Like, he's dangerous and intimidating. You feel scared for the other characters when he would show up again. But I think it was really important that they not just go, oh, look, the guy who had dedicated his life to this harmful Nazi ideology, oh, he now feels bad about it. It's all going to be fine. Now, like, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we need to adopt a general presentation of things of like people being beyond redemption. But again, it's very important that someone wants to be redeemed. And there are characters you can tell that story with. They could have done it with Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch, except they'd already really diluted the Nazi affiliation of Hydra by that point. But it could have shown with them how they joined out of anger for something, and hate groups tend to recruit people in crisis who are in fits of anger. Age of Ultron does that story a little bit, but only in relation to their connection with Ultron. It doesn't really address their association with Hydra. But it could have used them to tell that story. And if you want to go more lighthearted with a character like Bob, agent of Hydra, I don't think that's impossible, but you kind of have to paint him basically just as a doofus who isn't paying attention to what he signed up for. But Ward wasn't that. Ward was someone who had really dedicated a huge swath of his life to Hydra, so they were right to not redeem him. And what we get with Ward is someone who maybe had his doubts about Hydra in specific, but in terms of the kind of person he was that led him to be with them in the first place. And I'm not going through his backstory of how he ended up there, but like the kind of person that he was and that it shaped him into being, even away from Hydra as an organization, still a bad guy and a really fantastic villain. The point that I bailed was when they killed him and had him get possessed by, Hive, this really boring hive-mindy thing. It wasn't good, and it was such a waste of his character. Really ticked me off. But that brings me to another thing that I really would have rather that the MCU Hydra hadn't done. Because in the MCU, Hydra predates World War II and is more of a long-term death cult that just happened to align with the Nazis for a time. And again, there's some precedent for that in the comics, at least in terms of Hydra existing prior to the Nazis. But again, the comics have been pretty good about holding on to the idea of, yeah, Hydra was around before that. Hydra's been around after that. But they didn't land with the Nazis by accident. Their ideals aligned. Hydra was drawn to them. They had a lot in common. And with some of the infighting between different factionalizations of Hydra, there has at least always, to some degree, been a branch of Hydra that is still very devoted to those ideas and to that violent and hateful way of being. And that's kind of important. It kind of embraces the idea that, okay, even if you existed prior to this, you get tangled up with the Nazis, that's a taint you can't wash off. That is something that you don't just get to go, oh, no, that's not us anymore. It's a bit like how a certain kind of salute, regardless of whether or not it existed prior to Germany in the 30s and 40s, and no matter what you try and call it, whether you call it a Roman salute or anything else, it's always going to be the Nazi salute. Because regardless of what it might have been before, the identity of that thing has been fully subsumed by this hate, as did a lot of their aesthetics and symbols that they adopted, many of which pre-existed them, or at least some version of them existed prior to that particular group, but they still took them on board, and we still recognize them as being permanently tainted by what the Nazis used those to do and mean. If you want a slightly less loaded comparison, you can talk all day long about how adorning a tree in winter with baubles or lights or anything like that has its roots in a long-standing pagan tradition, but if I show you this, you're still going to think of it as a Christmas tree. The fact that it existed prior to any connection with Christianity whatsoever doesn't change the fact that it's been completely subsumed by Christianity and is going to hold that association probably for as long as Christianity continues to exist at all, and possibly longer. So at a certain point, the roots of something don't necessarily matter if you at least can maintain the acknowledgement that what it has become since is kind of more important than what it started out as. And that was something that the comics, again, for the most part, have managed to do that the MCU didn't, really. As soon as they introduced the death cult aspect, any actual political machinations, political ideology was pretty much gone. And like, you can make a connection between fascism and a death cult. Actually, it's pretty apt in a lot of ways. But the MCU seemed to use that more as a reason to just pretend the politics didn't happen. Oh, no, see, we're dealing with the death cult stuff. Okay, yeah, but that's not really what Hydra is now, regardless of what it was before. And this is part of why I want to see Hydra come back. I want to see them put up on screen as what they started out as, even though, you know, the MCU kind of botched it initially. I want to see them return with an acknowledgement of what they are, of what they represent. And again, maybe you could do that with Hydra Cap. That would certainly be a very bold way to do it. Again, I'm a little bit nervous at the idea of the current iteration of the MCU trying to tackle any of that, because I don't think I trust them to have the strength of their own convictions to do anything good with it. But it could. It'd be a possibility. And right now, they keep trying to go bigger galactic scale threats. You know, we're going to be getting literally Galactus in the Fantastic Four movie. They tried to do Kang. That has now since fallen apart, obviously. I will be curious to see what they do with Doctor Doom. That possibly is bringing things down to a smaller scale, but Doom is one guy. And if you wanted a threat that spanned a bit more and didn't feel like it was totally based around we just have to beat this guy, but actually is a larger scale threat, and have it be more complicated than just we have to punch this one dude real hard, Hydra's really good for that. Especially if you can marry what was dropped almost immediately, that connection to that ideology, to that political way of thinking, and marry it to what we got in Winter Soldier. The insidiousness of it, the infection of it, the ways that if you don't treat it and deal with it and keep it from spreading and check for it and make sure it's gone, it's going to come back. And it's going to get stronger when you're not looking, until suddenly you look around and wonder, how did we get here? I don't think that either Disney or Marvel have the guts to do this. But I'd be real pleased if they did.
I know Marvel understands that Hydra has some value. Marvel Rivals is bringing out Hydra stuff, and that game's hot shit right now. And from what I can see, they're keeping some of the fascistic iconography for that. I don't expect a game of that type to do much with it, but that's something.
Because Hydra is a threat that can really inject some meaningful politics back into these things. And like, not even necessarily complicated politics. Nazis bad. That's not very complicated. Indiana Jones manages that one just fine. It's not complicated politics. It's actually, one could even argue, oversimplifying politics. Because, like, well, don't we live in a time where everything is way more complicated than that? Boiling it down to just, this side bad, we punch them? Like, yeah, you could make that argument, but at this point, Marvel has been trying to do, to some degree, the more complex and nuanced stuff, and failing really hard at it, to the point of, honestly, kind of doing some damage in terms of how they are depicting people with points, but who go too far. Again, Flag Smashers come to mind. Killmonger, probably the best handled in terms of when Marvel has done that. God, Secret Invasion was so bad. Oh my gosh. But they can't handle the nuance. So rather than like, let's strip the politics out because you can't. Politics are in everything. Fine. Let's make it nice and simple again. Nazis are bad. Punch them. I will be really glad to see that some more. Honestly, it's probably part of the reason why I am softer on the fifth Indiana Jones than a lot of people are. I don't want to say that it's like a fantastic movie, but I certainly got more out of it than it seemed like a lot of people did. And I will freely admit that part of it was, it's really rewarding to see Indiana Jones biff Nazis again. Because we're not really getting it too much right now. And you could say it's oversimplified. It's a black and white. It's almost a child's view of politics. One side good, one side bad. Like, okay, yes, our modern politics are quite complicated and quite mixed up and quite tangled. But you know what? Sometimes, one side is just bad. And we used to all agree that it was the Nazis. And that is who Hydra is supposed to be. And who the comics usually remember that's who they are. Let's see if the movies and the shows can remember what this group is, what they mean, and as far as entertainment goes, how rewarding it should feel to see them get punched in the face as many times as it takes. Who knows if we'll ever get it? Probably not, but it was nice to think about all the same. Thank you for joining me for this little ramble. I appreciate it very much. If you enjoy this or anything else that I do, Patreon pays the bills, enables me to do this as my living, my full-time job, in fact. Even if you aren't able to help me out that way, I know things are tight. I know they're tight all over. Like, share, subscribe, also help. No bad thing. But you know what? Don't worry too much about it. There's plenty going on out there to worry about. You don't have to worry about that. What I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful. You are valid. And you are loved. Unless you're a Nazi, in which case, fuck off. But you are the council, and I am just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.
And now to thank my highest supporting Patreon supporters: Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfula, Goddess Elida, Welsh Wrestling Geeks, Oliver B., Melissa Pedersen, Movie Turtle, Ulrich Bogdan, Melinda Walters, Auntie Kate 808, Andre, Becky Sparks, Claire Wright, Fernabilax the Poodle, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, Quite Bearish, Rosalind Bennett, Adam R.D.L. Taylor, Palbo Rabajoggle, Mary Mello, Mira G, and Sir Didymus is my favorite. If you want to see me try and read your name while dealing with these little pains in my butt, check out the rewards on my Patreon and see if there's any that you like.